convinced that some of y'all are committed to misunderstanding the facts about the Quadajah Johnson case. I don't know if it's rage bait or arrested development, but I'm here today to bring you the facts about why Quadajah Johnson is no longer behind bars.
When people do the most, I do the analysis. Let's go.
Quadajah Johnson was indicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder back in December. So why did an appellate court later rule that she should be released from jail while awaiting trial? That's a question a lot of people have asked me, and quite honestly, I understand the confusion. What I don't understand, though, is why some people have convinced themselves that the Illinois Appellate Court has sided with the defense and concluded that Quadajah Johnson shot and killed Ramika Blackman in an act of self-defense. Where y'all hear that at? I mean, if you can't interpret the law, just say that. But don't come for me saying that I'm misleading or misinterpreting the law just to fit your narrative. To make things clear, the answer comes down to this. Neither the grand jury nor the appellate court were deciding the same legal question. But don't take my word for it. We're going to break it down. First, we're going to talk about the grand jury. And I'm not even going to assume y'all know what a grand jury is. A grand jury in Illinois is a group of 16 local citizens that are selected to determine whether there is sufficient evidence, also known as probable cause, to formally charge a person with a serious crime and proceed to a trial. And that's exactly what happened last year in December. A grand jury was presented with the state's evidence and allegations involving the death of Ramika Blackman. The grand jury met, they deliberated, and then ultimately returned what's called a true bill charging Quadajah Johnson with 6 counts of first-degree murder with intent to kill. Now, a lot of people hear the word indicted and assume that it meant the grand jury found Quadajah Johnson guilty. Now, that's not what an indictment means. An indictment means that the grand jury found that there was enough evidence or probable cause to formally charge Quadajah Johnson with the offenses presented by the state's prosecution and to move the case forward to trial. That's right, we've known since December of 2025 that this case was headed to trial. The grand jury was essentially asking this question. Is there enough evidence to formally accuse this defendant of these specific crimes and bring the case to trial? The grand jury was not, I repeat, they were not deciding whether Quadajah Johnson was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That decision belongs to the trial process. Now, another question people have is, why 6 counts of first-degree murder when there was only one victim? Well, the answer to that is that prosecutors can sometimes charge different legal theories or alleged acts arising from the same death. In other words, multiple counts don't mean 6 different victims. These multiple counts in the Quadajah Johnson case reflect different ways that the prosecution believes the law applies to the alleged conduct. The important thing to understand is this. 6 charges are not the same thing as 6 convictions. Quadajah Johnson has been charged, but she has not been convicted, at least not yet. The state of Illinois still has the burden of proving its case beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. So until the grand jury came back with an indictment, Quadajah Johnson was released from the Chicago Police Department without any charges while the death investigation continued. For those of you who thought Quadajah was free for those 87 days because of her self-defense claim, I'm sorry you got to hear it from me, but you were misinformed. Now let's move on to the appellate court. Again, I'm not going to assume that you know what the role of an appellate court is in any state, let alone Illinois. The Illinois Appellate Court is the middle court of review in the state's 3-tiered judiciary. Those tiers are the Circuit Court, which is Judge Clancy's court, the Appellate Court, which we're discussing now, and the Illinois Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the state of Illinois. The appellate court hears appeals from the trial level, if you will, or what's known as the circuit courts. Judge Michael Clancy's court in this case. Instead of conducting trials or hearing new evidence, a panel of judges within the appellate court, they review written briefs. They look at transcripts and oral arguments to determine if the law was applied correctly. The court is divided into 5 geographical judicial districts, each managing appeals within its own designated counties. District 1, where Quadajah Johnson's case is assigned, is in Cook County and they meet in Chicago, Illinois. So, what exactly did the appellate court actually decide? Well, we know the appellate court wasn't conducting a murder trial. That's not what they do. They also weren't deciding whether Quadajah Johnson was guilty or innocent. Again, not their job. They were reviewing a completely different issue. The First District Appellate Court of Illinois was asked this: should Quadajah Johnson remain detained in jail before trial, or should she be released with conditions while the case continues to trial? That's a pretrial detention issue. And the legal standard for detention is different. The appellate court was not answering if Quadajah Johnson committed first-degree murder. That's a question for the trial process. The question before the appellate court was essentially, did the state prosecution prove the legal requirements necessary to keep this defendant detained before trial? Those are 2 completely different legal lanes. The appellate court said no, and I get it. The Illinois Pretrial Fairness Act says everyone is presumed to be eligible for pretrial release. Don't shoot the messenger. There's no cash bond, and unless they have a violent criminal history, meaning that they've been convicted of a violent felony act in the past, then they can go home on pretrial release and continue to fight their case. Quadajah Johnson is no exception to that rule. Pregnant or not, it really doesn't matter. Quadajah met the eligibility requirement to be released under the Illinois Fairness Law, which is a subset of the Illinois Safety Act, and Judge Clancy denied her that right, based on his own fear that Quadajah Johnson would either reoffend or make a run for the border. Luckily for Quadajah, she has an elite litigator, Ari Williams, who's not letting even the slightest error get in the way of her client's rights. You don't have to like it, but you got to admit that Attorney Williams is a strong legal advocate for her clients, and sis knows her stuff. In her own words, she's the baddest. And I say she's the best to do it. Attorney Williams didn't do anything really spectacular, but she was not about to let the state play in her face when she knew her client was eligible for pretrial release. And listen, we don't want to take a chance of having this case thrown out on a technicality, because that's exactly how Attorney Williams wins a lot of her cases. One false move and the case gets dismissed. Here's the simplest way I can explain the real reason why Quadajah Johnson is not behind bars today. Quadajah Johnson was arrested by the Chicago police at the crime scene on September 8th of 2025 for the shooting death of Ramika Blackman. She admitted to the killing and she claimed that it was self-defense. The Chicago police was asked, was this a self-defense killing? They didn't have enough evidence at the time to determine that it wasn't a self-defense killing, so they released Quadajah without charges while they conducted their investigation. The case was then turned over to the state's attorney, who conducted their own investigation and convinced that this was not a self-defense case, but an intentional killing, and the state sought an indictment from a grand jury. The grand jury was asked, is there enough evidence to formally charge this person with these crimes? The grand jury said yes, and they charged Quadajah Johnson with 6 different counts of first-degree murder with intent to kill. That's why Quadajah was rearrested on December 4th. The baddest, Ari Williams, appealed the trial court's decision to keep her client detained, and the appellate court was asked, has the state met the legal requirements to keep this person in jail while waiting for trial. Ari knew that a person can be charged with a very serious crime and still be released before trial. Pregnant or not, that really has nothing to do with it. And Judge Clancy knew that a person can be detained before trial without ever being convicted, because pretrial detention is not a punishment for a conviction, and an indictment is not a conviction. Y'all still with me? Okay, now let me make something very clear for the 50th time. The Appellate Court did not say Quadajah Johnson did not intentionally kill Ramika Blackman and that it was self-defense. The Appellate Court didn't find her innocent. Where y'all getting this stuff from? The ruling never erased those 6 murder charges against Quadajah Johnson. The criminal case continues, and it will continue until trial. The state still has the opportunity to prosecute the murder charges, and that's exactly what they're doing while Quadajah is out on pretrial release. So for the people in the back, the case is still moving toward trial. What the appellate court ruled was that under the applicable pretrial detention law, the state didn't meet the necessary legal standard to keep Quadajah Johnson detained pending trial. That's why the case returned to the trial court for those release conditions. So miss me with all this self-defense rhetoric and understand that Quadajah Johnson was eligible for pretrial release, regardless of her crime, regardless of her pregnancy status, as long as she had a clean criminal record and wasn't deemed a flight risk. So now, if you're still wondering whether Quadajah Johnson can be charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, be released pretrial, and still face a future murder trial, the answer is yes, because those are separate stages of the criminal justice process. The grand jury's decision addressed whether there was probable cause for an indictment and can this case proceed as a formal criminal prosecution. And the answer was yes. The appellate court's decision addressed whether Quadajah should remain jailed before that prosecution was completed. And the answer was no. And the trial? Well, if this case proceeds to trial, is where the case will ultimately have to prove its allegations beyond a reasonable doubt. The only way this case doesn't make it to trial is if the defense requests a plea deal, which I really doubt, and I also doubt that the prosecution is going to offer one. Remember, the scales of justice is balanced, weighing facts and evidence to decide a verdict. If the prosecution gets caught slipping, even with the slightest legal error, that's when the baddest, Attorney Ari Williams that is, will make her signature move to get the entire case thrown out. But the trial is coming. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who can use this message. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and leave a comment down below letting me know your thoughts. Do you believe this case will make it to trial? And if it does, do you feel the state has a strong enough case to convict Quadajah Johnson of first-degree murder? Meet me in the comments. We can continue the conversation there.